investigating an insurrection. Congress extends the Select Committee's hearings into the storming of the U.S. Capitol. But will evidence lead to any consequences for the former president? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is the January 6th committee hearings. On January 6th, 2021, thousands traveled from across the United States to attend Donald Trump's Save America rally. His battle cry had convinced them that the 2020 election was stolen and that they had to stop it.
Our greatest achievements still wait. I think one of our great achievements will be election security, because nobody until I came along had any idea how corrupt our elections were. And again, most people would stand there at 9 o'clock in the evening and say, I want to thank you very much. And they go off to some other life. But I said, something's wrong here. Something's really wrong. Can't have happened. And we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
That kind of rhetoric resonated with many of Trump's biggest supporters. And while his entire presidency was plagued with scandal, it was his attempt to prevent the transition of power that arguably did the most damage to the country. The former commander-in-chief is accused of an attempted coup, and the congressional hearings into that fateful day have unveiled some shocking revelations.
When the first public hearing into the Capitol riot commenced, committee chairperson Benny Thompson opened proceedings with a warning.
Because of our democracy remains in danger, the conspiracy to thwart the will of the people is not over.
Throughout the series of hearings, the committee has been focusing on Trump's plan to overturn the result of the 2020 presidential election and the impact it could have had on the January 6th riots. On the second day of testimony, it emerged Donald Trump's inner circle had repeatedly told him his claims the election was stolen was false. But the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, is alleged to have kept endorsing Trump's obsession. On day 3, Vice President Mike Pence's chief of staff, Mark Short, testified that Pence made it clear to Donald Trump that he had no authority to block Biden's victory. But the commander-in-chief is said to have continued to pressure Pence, both publicly and privately. Former federal judge Michael Luttig said that if Pence had given in, it would have led to a constitutional crisis the likes the US had never seen. Officials in the key states of Arizona and Georgia are also alleged to have been pressured by the president to flip the vote. The panel played a phone call by Trump asking Georgia's Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to find enough votes to call the state in his favor.
Look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state.
Donald Trump is also accused of pushing Acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen to support his claims of electoral fraud. But when faced with Rosen's resistance, Trump is alleged to have wanted to replace him with a more compliant Jeffrey Clark.
The president turned to me and he said, well, one thing we know is you, Rosen, you aren't going to do anything. You don't even agree with the claims of election fraud. And this other guy at least might do something.
Well, the Capitol building is one of the most iconic in the United States. In 200 years, it's never been attacked. But as Congress was certifying Joe Biden's victory, Donald Trump supporters got heated outside the Capitol. Many of them hailed from a far-right group called the Proud Boys. It's believed the group's members helped provoke the crowd and push them to storm the Capitol. Soon, shots were fired, police were beaten, and the mob of Trump loyalists temporarily took control of the building, forcing lawmakers to hide as rioters hunted them down. Well, it seems logical that the disturbing events of that day should be investigated, but for the former president, it's nothing more than a political ploy. And the longer the hearings go on, the more Trump vents his frustrations. He's even released a 12-page rebuttal to the evidence against him and claims that he is the victim of a witch hunt orchestrated by Democrats.
Let's be clear, this is not a congressional investigation, this horrible situation that's wasting everyone's time. This is a theatrical production of partisan political fiction that's getting these terrible, terrible ratings, and they're going crazy. They're going crazy. The Unselects tried to use these tactics, and if they did, in a real court of law, everyone involved would be sanctioned and would be disbarred. If they were lawyers, they'd be disbarred for what they're doing. There's a one-sided witch hunt. They would be totally disbarred. We have nobody to even speak. We can't even speak.
But despite Trump's claims of partisan political fiction, the hearings continue, providing testimony and evidence that Trump's opponents hope will lead to his prosecution. And one of the first witnesses the committee called was documentary filmmaker Nick Quested. He had spent months following the far-right Proud Boys to include in a film about why Americans are so divided. He ended up in the middle of the January 6th insurrection, and he joins us now to talk about what he saw. Nick Quested, thanks so much for being with us. You know, you've seen, really a pleasure. You've seen war zones, Nick, from Afghanistan to Iraq and Syria. You've investigated gangs, you've investigated drug traffickers, yet at that first hearing, you said you bore witness to how violent January 6th really was. Like I said, this is from a man who's seen the worst of war zones. So how violent was it?
It was shocking because it was a different type of violence. Like if you're in a public disturbance, it's normally the crowd are fighting the police, and the violence is coming from the police trying to suppress the crowd. So in this instance, the violence was coming from the crowd. Certainly at the beginning, it was incredibly violent. And it was so shocking because this is where I live, and I wasn't expecting this at all. And I am from behind, and my camera was broken. It got swiped out of my hand. But at the same time, there was someone behind him who was like, "Leave him alone. This is the press, and they need to be here. This is a historic day."
Yeah, I mean, you said you expected, or you actually weren't expecting it to get so much out of control. But I mean, having spent so much time with the Proud Boys as you had, and having heard so much of Trump's rhetoric leading up to January 6th, did you maybe at one point suspect that things could spiral out of control?
I mean, I thought there was a possibility of violence. I thought it would have been a sort of scuffle between Antifa and BLM and the Proud Boys. I didn't expect the barriers to come down and the crowd to, basically invade the Capitol.
So when you were in there, I mean, was there a moment where you said, okay, wait a minute, there was actually a plan here that I wasn't aware of? Or was everything off script?
Well, the Proud Boys were very deliberate about their behavior earlier in the day. We arrived at the mall at 10:30 a.m. and we walked down the mall with the Proud Boys and around the Capitol building, past the reflecting ball, up and around, and then we went for lunch. And then immediately after lunch, we turned up at the Peace Circle, and within 5 to 7 minutes, the barriers had come down. And it was at that point when the barriers came down that the rhetoric changed from 1776 and Who Streets into a direct confrontation with the police. And then there was just more and more people. The barriers came down and there's just people flowing forward like water, just surrounding the police and pushing forward onto the steps. As you can see from these images, these are, it's very hard to not say that this is, incredibly,
Right. I mean, still seeing it now, it's overwhelming. It's hard to believe sometimes that is really what happened. But tell me, you mentioned the police and their confrontation with the police. What did you make of the defenses around the Capitol? Some say the Capitol Police were woefully underprepared. But what were they really up against?
Well, when we walked past the first time, I remember this distinctly at 11:52 because I took a photo. The Proud Boys are walking north on the west side of the Capitol, and in the background, you can see one police officer at the barriers. Now, I'm walking past with 200 to 300 Proud Boys. That, I don't understand why there was less people than there would have been for a football match. I mean, how many police are there at a football match where there's 60 to 70,000 people?
It's a point I've heard made many times, and we've never gotten a real answer to it. And now, I mean, so at least there were some police that seemed to have at least prevented the storming by maybe a few minutes. Because if you think they had gotten into the Capitol any sooner, could they have gotten to Mike Pence and harmed him or any other lawmaker for that matter?
Oh, I absolutely think so. The crowd was in rapture. And we actually filmed the crowd mounting the stairs near Nancy Pelosi's office, chanting for her. And I've subsequently learned that Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker, was in her office 4 to 5 minutes before that clip was taken. So if the police hadn't held the line for the short period that they did at the bottom of the Western Plaza, I think we could have seen a very different result.
You know, Nick, you are British, but you have spent many years in the United States. Have you been able to make sense of America's kind of conflictual social and political dynamics? And in the end, were you actually able to answer your own question about why Americans are so divided?
No, I don't know if I can answer why. I think I showed that they are. I think it's there's a little bit different. I mean, I think the root causes of division go back, hundreds of years, and more pointedly, in the last 20 years, we've seen a seismic shift in the polarity of thought in America, and a lack of compromise.
Nick Quested, we're going to have to leave it there. Really great to have you with us. Thanks so much for being on the Newsmakers. Okay, let's get more now on where Americans on both sides of the political spectrum stand over the January 6th hearings. And joining us now from Alexandria, Virginia, is Frank Buckley. He is a professor of law at George Mason University and author of How the Trump Victory Drove Everyone Crazy and Why It Was Just What We Needed. And Robert Gutsche is a senior lecturer at Lancaster University. He's author of The Trump Presidency, Journalism and Democracy. Thanks both so much for being with me. Robert, let me start with you. I just want to cut to the chase here. We've heard evidence, all sorts of testimony, much of it from Trump's own staff members, including even his own daughter. But will it lead to a criminal referral and prosecution of the former president?
Well, I'm certainly not the legal scholar on the panel, but my sense is no. I think that in addition to whatever sort of protections the president might have while she or he is president, certainly I don't see this moving into that direction. I think this is more of a political perspective on things. And by that I mean, I think this is Democrats really trying to put into place what might have gone wrong that day, that then can come back and be helpful for them in an election. I think that this, for whatever bipartisan support it might be, is a sense of trying to have some sort of transparency. But I think for Republicans, this is certainly an opportunity to hold up and say, look, Trumpism can still be alive and well. Look at all these people trying to bash its name, and we need to stand up for what's going forward. We have to remember that this is not just an election cycle here, but we're coming up on a presidential election here in the next couple of years. That'll start. If it doesn't start usually on the first day of a presidency, it'll start quite soon.
Okay, you said you think the Democrats might find this helpful for political purposes, but really, I mean, Robert, if these hearings do not lead to charges and a case against President Trump, I mean, what's the point? What's the real value in doing this for the American people?
Well, this is creating this is a production, right? And whichever side of this you might come down on, this has really been a well-orchestrated video-heavy production, one that is in prime time, one that is beautiful to look at despite the scariness of the images that are coming through. For some people, this becomes a bit of artifact, right? This is something that can be reproduced into ads. to get Democrats out to vote. I mean, that's one thing Democrats might struggle with sometimes, is getting people to the polls. And this is something that says, here's video evidence in a world of social media where if you don't have video, it didn't happen, sort of nonsense, right? But this is evidence of saying, look at what we're up against. Come vote for our candidate. And I think having this, reproducing these images over and over again in a very formal sort of setting, but also with this raw footage like what you're seeing right now, is very powerful political weaponry.
Okay, let me turn to Frank, because you don't seem to disagree, but you also seem to think that these hearings actually kind of hurt America's democracy by really wasting government time and resources and deepening partisan divides. So, I mean, should what happened on January 6th then just be forgotten?
Well, no, and in fact, I think that while you've made a great deal of how divided we are, I think on this one, Americans have come together. You know, we're all appalled by what happened on January 6th, and we'd all, I think, like to put pay to Trump as a politician. I don't think it's necessary or useful or desirable to try to prosecute Trump when one shouldn't want to do that generally in a democracy. But the main thing is in the eyes of serious Republicans, Trump is so discredited at this point, you'll not find very many people willing to stand up for him. They exist, to be sure, but the ticket to victory in the future for Republicans is going to be people who will say, well, look, Trump had some good ideas, but Trump the man was a failure as a politician. And what happened on January 6th was discreditable, horrible, and will really write pay to Trump as a politician. In that sense, curiously, I think the Republicans may be the beneficiary of all of this. It's a very partisan set of hearings. It's a show trial. It's meant to present a Democratic narrative. But in the end, I think it'll help Republicans say, look, we've had our chance with Trump. That didn't work out. Time to move on.
Frank, I got to say, I'm surprised to hear you say that. I mean, you have said the Republican Party is effectively letting go of Donald Trump. And you said that it has had to say goodbye. Are you sure about that? Because there is a lot of very serious talk about him making a return in the 2024 election.
Yes, and where is that coming from? Only from Democrats. Look, what's going on in America right now is we have a tremendous problem with inflation, and we have a president that most people think is really incompetent for the job. Indeed, he's the most unpopular president in memory. And his vice president is worse still in the eyes of most Americans. So the Democrats really have only one issue to run on, and that's Trump. If they want to tell you that Trump's a real issue, that he's going to run again, consider the source. This isn't coming from serious Republicans. This is coming from Democrats, and this is the only card they have to play. But it's not a card that's going to win. I think everybody's realized it's it for Trump.
This is what confuses me. And Robert, I can ask you about this as well. I mean, for Republicans, being involved in the insurrection it's not a disqualifier. And in fact, the potential next governor of the state of Michigan, it's Republican Ryan Kelly, who was actually arrested for his participation in the insurrection. He's still gaining in the polls. And then inversely, you see Liz Cheney, who looks to be completely losing her place in the party. It runs contrary to what we've been kind of hearing from Frank. How do you reconcile this?
Well, I've argued for a long time that what's led to Trump has been a trickle-up effect. And this was something that happened at the local level. This was, George Bush came in as a conservative, compassionate conservative. 9/11 happened, changed the entire narrative of the presidency, and I think a lot of hopes and dreams for conservatives. Then we move into Barack Obama, which was maybe a conservatives or Republicans' worst nightmare based upon issues of race, based upon issues of policy, certainly, and ideology, ideas, issues of faith, schools. I mean, they're very anti that presidency, right? This was a hope, I think, for conservatives that they were going to be able to come back and push a lot of agendas. I think you're seeing some of those agendas coming through with discussions on abortion, on gun rights and gun control, but also on cultural things. So this was something that happened at a local level where people were talking about 10 commandments in public parks for 20, 30 years. You had issues of bathrooms and gender. You had issues of, other policies about sanctuary cities. That moved up into kind of what you're talking about here, into state houses. And you had particular state houses where the governors were working together to push conservative agendas that then moved into, and this might be a very simplistic sort of construction here, but I think that one of the issues is in media and as scholars and as people who are engaged with trying to watch these things, we often look at national people and levels to try and understand what's going on. And that becomes very confusing because a lot of these elections ultimately do go down to the local levels of the constituents of who can get out to vote and what those issues are. And the cultural contestation that's happening certainly is showing itself on national levels, but it's really at the ground level.
But I mean, Frank, this is what's kind of frightening in all of this, because what we saw on January 6th, it was horrific. I don't think anybody can say it was not. People died. The Capitol was stormed. This 200 years without an event like that. I'm surprised you disagree, because what kind of example does it set to see an event like that take place? Know that people died in the storming of the Capitol and no consequences, no criminal consequences whatsoever for what was behind it on that day. Go ahead.
If I might make a suggestion, perhaps you might chill it a little bit. It was dreadful. It was not an insurrection. Insurrections are not made by crazy people with painted faces wearing horns on their head, right? It was a case where one person died, was killed, and she was shot by the police. It really was a horrible media event, which was quickly over, and it looked like the heroes of the piece, in fact, were conservative Republicans who had enough of Trump. People like the Attorney General Bill Barr, who said there's no fraud here, and people like the Vice President who behaved heroically in all of this, and everybody, all of Trump's aides at this point, with the exceptions of a few crazies, were saying, for God's sakes, Trump, you have to chill. What Trump did was really quite despicable in some respects. The worst thing he did was encourage people to go after Mike Pence in the middle of all of this. I mean, I think that's really unforgivable. I mean, that's the point, I think, at which Republicans said, look, we've really had enough of Trump. He did something initially that was valuable. He put paid to an older right-wing Republican Party. He brought new themes to the party, themes about the fact that we've become a class society, the fact that there's a lot of corruption. He was talking about issues like immigration that right-wing Republicans weren't talking about. And I think that's healthy for the party. And I think those issues will remain. But Trump himself is toast.
Okay.
The only wants to skim around is the Democrats.
All right. We've just got a few minutes left. Robert, I mean, am I being dramatic by calling what we saw on January 6th horrific? I don't feel like I am. I know I'm not the only one that was absolutely shocked by what we saw and by what happened. And now to know that there may be absolutely no criminal consequences for what led to it, I find it disturbing. Do you not?
Well, let's be clear, first of all, also that more than one person died, maybe not on that site, but certainly more people died related to that from heart conditions and injuries and other things. So that death toll did extend beyond that, first of all. Second of all, this is kind of a manifestation of really weird language and metaphors and symbols that, this was a draining of the swamp. Donald Trump said, we're going to get rid of, career politicians. We're going to get rid of things. We're going to take back the House. We're going to take back things. And even though that's a metaphor and that might sound silly to some people, and I'm not subscribing to some of these things myself, but is that these aren't career politician and K Street lobbyist buildings. These are the buildings of the American people. And so there are sects of people, and they're not just the crazies. I mean, some of them are my family, and they may think I'm the crazy. But is the notion that at some point we need to say, if American democracy exists and is about the citizens, then this type of behavior, whether it's disgusting or not, is a culmination of elected officials who are sitting in offices with suits, lifetime health insurance and protection, beautiful houses, multiple houses, lots of money, no understanding of what the price of milk is, telling us how to dictate our lives. And that's coming from a large swath of Americans. I'm not saying I subscribe, not saying I don't. I'm just saying that's where a lot of us get really confused, and we say there's only one way to interpret this, that this was horrible and despicable. But let's go back to remember the origination of this country, which was the same thing. I'm sure people had painted faces. I'm sure they were wearing silly things. That's what we teach in school. And as we have states and governments saying critical race theory and other things can't be taught, alternatives to those dominant ideas of Americana can't be taught, that's how generations are going to continue to see America as celebratory of its military, celebratory of its initial violence, and recognizing this possibly as a maintaining of citizen control.
Okay, Robert Gutsche. I'm going to have to give you the final word. Very unfortunately, we're out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers, but I'd like to thank you and Frank Buckley as well for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey, and we'll see you next time.